Now we fast forward, again roughly 200 years, and this time to the Battle of Waterloo, in which Napoleon and around 105,000 troops faced off against two armies. You might not be aware of this because we think of it as a British victory, but there were 68,000 mainly English and Dutch troops led by the Duke of Wellington, and there were 45,000 Prussian troops commanded by a Field Marshal Blucher. So Prussia, by the way, is part of what is now Germany, and it was its own little state, well, fairly big state during this period, and it was quite a powerful military state, was Prussia. The scale of warfare was huge by this time, and with well over 200,000 people involved, it took great generalship to organise a victory in this carnage. I've led battlefield trips to Belgium and France, and it's tough to control 60-odd students, and rarely are they actually trying to kill or maim one another. I can't really comprehend how tough it must be to try to control and influence a battle of 200,000. I mean, there's no way you'd even be able to see everyone at once, and there's no walkie-talkies for quick communication. Anyhow, though I'd expect you've probably heard of Waterloo, I bet you've never heard of somewhere called Quatre Bras. Well, Quatre Bras was the scene of the first meeting of the armies, which was the day before Waterloo. And it resulted in something of a bit of a minor French victory, because the Prussian army was forced into a retreat. It had to leave the scene. And Wellington lost contact with 45,000 allies. Napoleon tried to chase the Prussians away, chase them down and catch them, so he sent one of his trusted marshals called Marshal Grouchy to chase down the Prussians along with 33,000 of his men. So this meant, because of Quatre Bras, when the armies met again the next day on the 18th of June, or 2 days later I believe actually, Wellington had 68,000 troops facing 72,000 Frenchmen. If Napoleon was able to win the battle, this is kind of how it all turned on. Before the battle started, it came down to this. If Napoleon could win the battle before the Prussians could return, then he could make his small advantage in numbers count. However, we know Wellington didn't lose the battle, or we wouldn't have named a whole train station after the battle, would we? Despite having a slightly smaller force at the beginning, Wellington managed to emerge victorious. Like Cromwell and the hedges at Naseby, and the English at Agincourt, one of the main reasons was because Wellington made very clever use of the terrain. In addition to being able to exercise firm command of his disciplined troops, perhaps like the new model army had first shown at Naseby. So terrain and discipline won the day to some extent. But the Prussians arriving at the end certainly was huge. So to the battle itself. To help us understand this huge battle, we need a bit of a map, I think, for us to look at. Wellington was well aware that he would have the best chance of winning if the Prussians arrived to join the fight. So he set up his army for defence so that the battle would last as long as possible. Napoleon, at times, kind of played into Wellington's hands in this respect, because although Napoleon was one of the greatest generals of all time, at this time he was suffering from piles, which some historians suggest affected his judgment, and it certainly would have had an impact on his ability to ride quickly around the battlefield to command his troops. Interesting fact! Piles are enlarged blood vessels found inside or around an anus. They can pop out of your bottom in a big swollen pile and be very painful. Galloping on a horse is probably one of the most uncomfortable things you could do when you have piles. So it is understandable that this might have been distracting for Napoleon. One way in which Napoleon played into Wellington's hands in terms of Wellington's tactic of making the battle last as long as possible was by delaying the French assault, because Napoleon thought that the muddy ground was no good for a cavalry charge, and he thought he needed the hot June sun to harden up the ground a bit. Perhaps Napoleon had been reading his history and sought not to repeat the French mistakes at Agincourt of a cavalry charge in the mud. Napoleon could have still attacked and just held his cavalry in reserve, but he felt that he needed his cavalry if battle was to be joined. Cavalry had been crucial in many of Napoleon's greatest victories, and he'd had many of them. And it wasn't his style to begin an assault with an infantry charge. So, despite June days being long, and the sun having been up for many hours, Napoleon didn't actually begin his attack until 11:30 a.m. And he started it, as with most of the battles at the time, with an artillery barrage intended to soften up the enemy. Here, Wellington had made a very clever decision, because he put his army just on the back of a slope, so most of the French artillery sailed over the crest of the hill and over the heads of the British. In addition, the mud meant that many of those cannonballs and canisters of shrapnel that did get close to hitting the English were swallowed by the mud, and their impact was deadened. This was important because Napoleon had about 100 more cannon than the British, so he had a bit of an advantage there. Wellington didn't fire his cannon back. He fired some back, but he didn't fire most of them back. Instead, he kept them unfiring so that he could use them later on. The cannon fire continued, and it did actually cause some devastating injury and death, even if many of the shots failed to find their target. Yet the British, disciplined and drilled as they were, stood and took it as ordered. Now, if you remember the training and recruitment podcast about the 18th century and early 19th century British army, you'll know they're very well drilled, very well disciplined, and the penalty for doing things like running away or not standing where you're ordered to stand would be so severe that they would stand where they're told to stand. The first salvos of battle with this artillery bombardment had not really gone as Napoleon would have wanted. Wellington must have been delighted that Napoleon had waited until just before the afternoon, just before 12 noon, to begin his main assault on the British. Every minute that went by was another minute closer to the possibility of the Prussians reaching the battle. So he wanted to delay it, and Napoleon, he delayed it a little bit to begin with. As we have mentioned, Wellington positioned most of his troops on the back of a slope, but not all of his troops. If you look at the map we've got, you'll see a chateau, a farmhouse, and a place called Papelotte, which is actually the name of a farm. He hid some mobile, light field artillery, which means like some cannons that would be able to easily hook up to horses so they could be quickly transported around the place. He hid them behind a very thick hedge at Papelotte, which reminds me a bit of Cromwell's dragoons at Naseby. And he put some exceptionally brave soldiers in the chateau and farmhouse, standing way out from the British lines and clearly likely to be the first to bear the brunt of the feared French army. These men, I think, deserve a special mention, because I doubt I'd have been brave enough to wait in the chateau or farmhouse in preparation for facing 72,000 Frenchmen who wanted to kill me, while the rest of the army was back behind a slope. So, to give them a bit of a mention, in the chateau were the Coldstream Guards, and in the farmhouse was the King's German Legion. Interesting fact, the King's German Legion was formed when people from Germany escaped to England after Napoleon's armies conquered what is now Germany in 1803. It was a mix of British and German expatriates, which means people who used to live in Germany but left. But it was part of the British Army and had fought throughout the Napoleonic Wars as part of the British Army. The British king at the time was George III, whose grandfather, George I, had been born in Germany before coming to be King of England. So there was a really strong Anglo-German link, and it was quite natural that when German lands fell to the French, the Germans would seek to continue to fight for the German King of England. Until the First World War, we Brits were actually quite close to the Germans, and many cities had little Germanys, which you could think of a bit like Chinatowns, except they had places like German butchers instead of Chinese restaurants. My great-granddad was called Ernst Benneker, and he was a German immigrant, but when the First World War broke out, he changed his name to Ernest Bennett. So this English-German link, which was really strong, kind of fell apart about 100 years later when the First World War broke out and the Germans started to try and kill us. Anyway, back to the fighting. The chateau and the farmhouse were defensible structures and were prepared as such. They would help to slow the French attack. Remember, Wellington's trying to slow them down so the Prussians could arrive. And if Napoleon decided not to deal with these two defensive structures and leave them behind, then the British in the chateau and the farmhouses could shoot into the backs of the French as they went forward to attack the main British lines. It left Napoleon with a bit of a dilemma. Does he attack the chateau and farmhouse, or does he leave them? Napoleon decided he had to take the buildings. However, it could, and in this case it certainly did, take a lot of effort to dislodge soldiers from buildings. So here was a clever move by Wellington that would hopefully blunt the French attack and or hold them up for longer. So putting his troops on the back of a slope to make the French artillery less effective was a clever Wellington move, and putting some men in the buildings. Even though it was probably quite heartless and he knew that the chances that those men would be killed was quite high, he was willing to leave them out there. Napoleon decided to first attack the chateau on the left, or the farmhouse, chateau. It's kind of the same thing. It's called Hougoumont Farm, hoping that it would draw out Wellington's reserves from behind the slope. But Wellington was willing to leave the Coldstream Guards to their fate for the sake of the rest of the army. That must have sucked really bad when the Coldstream Guards found that they were to face a huge proportion of the French army on their own, and that nobody was coming to help, because Wellington was willing to sacrifice these men for the sake of the whole army. There was a desperate fight for control of this place called Hougoumont Farm, and at one very dramatic, desperate point, the French actually broke through the gates, only for the British to manage to shut the gates. The French left trapped inside were butchered with bayonets, and the attack that Napoleon had hoped would, what he hoped from this attack, that the British would try and reinforce the position and it would draw them away from their slope, but it only ended up causing massive French casualties. Interesting fact. I'm going to diverge a little bit from here, so if you want to fast forward the podcast, you can. But this bit I find quite interesting because Wellington thought that Hougoumont Farm was the key to the battle afterwards. So, not all of the French soldiers that were trapped in Hougoumont Farm were butchered. There was a small 11-year-old drummer boy who ended up inside. The British soldiers, despite fighting desperately to stay alive and despite seeing their friends cut or shot down by the Frenchmen, still managed to find it in their hearts to spare the little 11-year-old French drummer boy, whose job would have been to play the drum in time for the soldiers to march. Here is an account of the dramatic events that took place at Hougoumont Farm from warfaremagazine.co.uk. Settle back and see if you can imagine the scene that happened just over 200 years ago, as just a few hundred men in a corner of a vital section of the battlefield fought to decide the fate of Europe. Some French soldiers of the light regiment rushed forward and made a determined effort to break in through the half-open gate. At their head was a giant of a man called Lieutenant Legros, apparently known as l'Enforceur, or the Smasher. Seizing an axe, he swung it against the panels of the gate and forced his way into Hougoumont farmyard. A number of Frenchmen, some accounts say as many as 100, followed him inside, as soldiers on both sides continued to fight over the gate. Some of the French reached as far as the chateau itself, but they all came under intense fire from the chateau windows, as well as from the buildings on all sides. I imagine they would have said, chateau. One group pursued a British officer called Lieutenant Wilder as far as the farmer's house, and as Wilder grasped the handle of the door to open it so that he could run inside, a French sapeur cut off his hand with an axe. But the French were heavily outnumbered and had little chance. Before long, every one of them was killed or wounded, except for one unarmed drummer boy who was spared. The massive L'Enforceur himself died near the chateau, his axe still grasped in his hand. But even as the fighting was taking place inside Hougoumont, more French were trying to force their way through the gate into the courtyard. A man called Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald was at a different gate defending it when he became aware of the danger, and at once realised that it was vital that the great gate be closed. He had 3 other officers with him: Lieutenant Colonel Wydham, Ensign Hervey, and Ensign Gooch, and shouting for them to join him, MacDonald rushed toward the gate. As the 4 of them reached the gate, they were joined by a few more soldiers, making 10, and thrusting their way forward, the group of 10 drove back any enemy in their way and fought their way to this gate, the crucial gate. Colonel MacDonald, who was a large, strong man, put his shoulder to the gate, together with Corporal James Graham, who was also of heavy build. Others joined in, either adding their weight to the gates or thrusting back the Frenchmen who were still trying to force their way in. Very slowly, bit by bit, the 2 heavy gates were pushed together and held in position until they could be barricaded. There was a rush to collect any timbers or anything that was heavy that could be used to reinforce the gate, and finally, the massive crossbar was dropped into position. The gates at Hougoumont were closed, but it had been a near-run thing. The struggle was not yet over, however. Even while the gate was being secured, some of the enemy tried to scale the walls, and one French grenadier, standing on the shoulders of a comrade, leaned over the top and took aim at Colonel Wydham. Fortunately, Wydham saw him out of the corner of his eye. He hurriedly handed a musket to Corporal Graham beside him, who fired at the same second as the Frenchman, and it was the Frenchman who fell back, shot in the brain. So, the great gate at Hougoumont was closed, and was never again forced by the enemy. Nor indeed did any enemy penetrate into Hougoumont for the rest of the day, and Wellington later declared that the success of the Battle of Waterloo turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. So perhaps the dash of just 10 men on a battlefield of 200,000 to help shut the gates also decided the Battle of Waterloo, because it delayed the French, inflicted big casualties on the French, and the position itself put the French army at such a disadvantage. Apparently, many of the men who fought at Hougoumont, such was the ferocity and gruesome horror of the day, went on to suffer terribly from flashbacks and nightmares for the rest of their lives. Windham, one of the officers who ran to shut the gates, was so traumatized that it was said that he never shut a door again for the rest of his life. It's really difficult to imagine how much of a hell these men went through to hold up the French at Waterloo on behalf of the British Army. So, back to the main story and the things you need to know for your exam. After the attempted diversion failed at Hougoumont, Napoleon moved to the main assault of the British forces, and, characteristically of the brilliant French general, he tried something different, and that was that he tried sending his troops to attack in column formation, which means with fewer men showing at the front and with many men lined up behind. The disadvantage of this was, with fewer men showing at the front of the line, meant you had fewer men to fire on the enemy. But the advantage would be that once battle was joined, once they'd actually reached the British, the idea would be, because they're in a big line, these columns of men would smash through the thin lines of the British easier. A great idea. But Wellington countered it by having his own unusual formation and asking his men to form in squares, hollow squares, so there were no soldiers in the middle of the square, and they put cannon at each corner of the square, so that when the French columns broke through the British lines into a square, they found themselves in the middle of a square, surrounded by the English. Clever Welly. As the assault hit, Wellington ordered his light mobile artillery out from behind the thick hedge that I told you about, and they fired upon the flanks of the French. So, if you get older and find yourself as a general of an army, learn the lessons from Naseby and Waterloo, and make sure you always check behind hedges before you start a battle. So, at 1 p.m, finally, the main forces of the British and the French joined battle, and by all accounts it was absolute carnage, with cannonballs tearing off limbs, musket balls shattering bones, and the constant screaming of men and horses. The battle was in deadlock. At 3 p.m, it was still not clear who would win. At this point, Napoleon could have withdrawn and tried to join up with Gooch and his 33,000 men, who had left to chase down Blucher, so that he could fight another day, especially because there was every chance that the Prussians would make it to the battlefield the longer the battle went on, but Napoleon did not choose to withdraw. Instead, he chose to push the assault further, and indeed, one of his most celebrated generals, a man named Marshal Ney, and his men, managed to take the farmhouse that was in the middle in the front of the British line at 6:15 p.m, and they created a gap in the British lines. Ney immediately sent word asking for Napoleon to send in the Imperial Guard to exploit the gap. These were Napoleon's elite troops. But, although this could have been the turning point for the French in the battle, either because he didn't want to risk his best troops, or because he was annoyed, some historians think, that it had taken Ney so long to make an opening, Napoleon didn't send them. For many, this has been cited as a turning point in the battle, and had Napoleon decided to send in his Imperial Guard at this point, they suggest the battle might have been won for the French. But this is what is known as counterfactual history. We can't possibly know this for sure because it didn't happen. Wellington reacted to the break in his lines created by Marshal Ney by quickly leading reserves to try to plug the gap and to throw the French back, which he actually managed to achieve. At about 7:15 p.m, an hour after this, crisis point for the British, the Prussians arrived, fresh and ready for battle. They'd given Gucci and his men the slip, so they still weren't there. Napoleon was now outnumbered, and he sent in his Imperial Guard at 7:15, but Wellington, sensing the advantage, it was too late for Napoleon to send his Imperial Guard now, so Wellington, sensing the advantage, now swung his way, had ordered his infantry and cavalry to leave their defensive positions and go onto the attack. He thought the time was now, the Prussians have arrived, and the French were overrun. Waterloo was a close-run thing, but Wellington managed through a combination of his own wise decisions and Napoleon's mistakes to let the battle run long enough for the Prussians to arrive. The placement of his troops on the reverse of a slope and in strong defensive positions, the brave men at Hougoumont and the other places, defensive structures, the hidden light mobile artillery behind the hedges at Papaloette, the defensive squares in reaction to Napoleon's columns, and his patient defensive strategy all point to bold, decisive leadership on Wellington's part. But don't forget that Napoleon's mistakes, such as waiting so long to attack, or not sending his Imperial Guard in when they requested, and the mud that made the French artillery less effective, as well as, of course, the timely arrival of the Prussians, also made significant contributions to the Allied victory at Waterloo.